Jonnu Smith has officially been traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll tell you what that means for his dynasty value next.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. You can also check me out over on the Locked On Cowboys podcast. And joining me today, as always, is Michael Fabiano. You can follow him on Twitter at Michael_Fabiano. You can also check out all of his great work over on SI. And on today's show, we're talking about the big trade that happened on Monday. Jonnu Smith, officially a Pittsburgh Steeler after weeks of this being rumored. But let's first start with Smith before we get to all the other pieces of this trade. How does this impact his dynasty value and fantasy value going from the Dolphins to the Steelers?
I mean, it's not good. I mean, there's no question about that. I don't think it's a death blow, Marcus, but it's certainly not good. But I think we also have to keep in mind that what Jonnu Smith did last year was not something that he was going to duplicate, not even in Miami. It just wasn't going to happen. It was a tale of two seasons in 2024. Over the first 10 weeks, he was a tight end 16. He was averaging 8 points per game. And then he went nuts. Like, he turned into Travis Kelce in the final 8 games, 19 plus fantasy points 5 times. And he scored 148.7 points. Like, that just was not going to happen again. Now, people online, I see them thinking that this is the end of Jonnu Smith now that he's going to Pittsburgh. I don't necessarily think it's the end. He wasn't going to be the tight end 4 again. And now I have him dropped out of my top 10 altogether. In Dynasty, of course, he's 30 years old, so he's not exactly a player that you're going to be targeting. But a big reason why the Steelers got Jonnu Smith was Arthur Smith, because Arthur Smith was Jonnu's coach in Tennessee and then for a year in Atlanta. And also, I think this is something that maybe some people just on the service aren't paying attention to. But Jonnu Smith is a wide receiver in a tight end's body. No tight end ran more routes on the perimeter last year than Jonnu Smith. Now, it's not a majority. It was 24%. But who are the Steelers wide receivers beyond DK Metcalf, Robert Woods, and Calvin Austin? And I mean, there's just not a lot. So I don't think this is a death blow, but it certainly hurts. It certainly hurts. Also, when you look at his routes run or his positions in terms of where he lined up in line last year, he's 41st among tight ends because he's not a blocker. He's a pass catcher. And that's going to be the same sort of scenario in Pittsburgh. The problem is that not only is that magical season not going to be duplicated from a year ago, but now you have to contend with Pat Freiermuth, who is also coming off of a career year of his own.
I think this is a death knell for Jonnu Smith, honestly, because you look at what Jonnu has done previously with Arthur Smith, and that's playing with like guys like Kyle Pitts and some of the other tight ends. His best season ever with Arthur Smith was 448 yards and 8 touchdowns. Now, the 8 touchdowns are great.
Well, no,
you can't bank on that every week.
In Atlanta, he had 582 yards and was the tight end 16 while playing with Kyle Pitts. So I don't think it hurts big time. But is he a backup tight end in fantasy? Yeah. I mean, he had 70 targets in Arthur Smith's offense in 2023 in Atlanta. And they ran more 12 personnel than any team in the league last year. And I think that's going to be the case again in 2025 with Pittsburgh. They're going to run a lot of 12 personnel. So while I would agree that, he ain't going to be a tight end 4, he's probably not going to be the tight end 10, he's probably not going to be the tight end 12, but can he be a guy that you can draft as a backup who could potentially get some opportunities here and there and maybe be utilized during the bye weeks or if you have an injury? I think yes. Like, for me, a death blow is like, I don't want him. I ain't drafting him, and he's off my radar. I don't think he's off our radar. He's off our radar as a tight end 1, but I don't think he's off our radar completely.
He is for me because what's the upside here? Like, even when he was a full-time player in Miami, 800 yards and 8 touchdowns is really good, but we both agreed he wasn't going to do that in Miami. He's not going to do that in Pittsburgh. We know the Steelers want to run the football, right? And I was looking at some of the tweets from the Steelers beat reporters yesterday, which is always a scary thing to do, but they basically said they view him as a fullback, H-back hybrid player of the offense. That doesn't sound like someone that's going to be putting up big-time fantasy production. And what's scary is Freiermuth and Jonnu Smith basically play the same position. They also have Darnell Washington, who is their clear blocking tight end. And I just don't really want very many parts of the Steeler offense outside of DK Metcalf, who we'll get to in a little bit. And I think Fabs, for me, if I'm looking at Jonnu as a backup tight end in my dynasty leagues, I would just rather shoot for somebody that has more upside or has a path to being the clear-cut starter in their passing offense. Like, I'll give you an example. Right now on Dynasty League Football, Jonnu Smith is tight end 16. I'm looking at like Brenton Strange, who's tight end 23, starting tight end in Jacksonville with Trevor Lawrence and an offense that we think is going to throw the ball more. I would just much rather have Brenton Strange than 1 year of Jonnu Smith in Pittsburgh, because that's all he is on, is a 1 year deal with a quarterback who's on a 1 year deal, who said he's likely to retire after the year, on an offense that wants to just play ball control. I just don't see it.
Yeah, for me, if I'm in a dynasty startup, I just don't see a scenario where Jonnu Smith doesn't get drafted. He's going to be picked late. And again, I'm saying he's going to be a tight end too. He's going to be a backup tight end.
I just don't want it to be my team. That's all. I don't want it to be to me. He's like the definition of the roster clock.
And also, I mean, this is a 1 year thing too, potentially. Looking long term in Pittsburgh is like impossible because Aaron Rodgers is not going to be the quarterback in 2026. No. We know that. Who the hell knows what's going to happen in terms of like, does Arthur Smith actually have legs in Pittsburgh, or is he gone if the offense doesn't produce well? I think it's really hard to look long-term dynasty-wise from a Steelers perspective, but just from a pure 2025 perspective, I think there's a role for Jonnu Smith to potentially be a top 15 or 16 tight end this upcoming season. Again, that's a huge drop-off from what he was last season. But the Steelers have one wide receiver. That's it.
I know.
And if they line Jonnu Smith up 24% of the time out on the perimeter, which is what the percentage was last year, again, he led the position in perimeter routes, then that gives him even more opportunities. I mean, Pat Freiermuth's not going to be lining up on the perimeter at all. He's going to be primarily in slot. And in terms of dynasty, you also got to wonder, this has got to hurt Calvin Austin too. I mean, because like he was their primary slot guy, and now you got Freiermuth and Jonnu who are going to be running routes out of the slot. I just think Jonnu's versatility in a seasonal league makes him more attractive to me than Pat Freiermuth. But obviously in dynasty, Freiermuth is the more attractive play.
Yeah, and to be honest, I don't really want either. Pat Freiermuth, tight end 22. I was already out on Pat Freiermuth before this, just because you kind of know what these tight ends are at this stage of their career. Once you get into year 5, year 6, if they haven't had one of these big seasons, they're not going to have it. And now Pittsburgh's brought in someone like Jonnu Smith. I don't know. I just don't see it.
Also, too, I just want to bring up one other thing. Like you had said, that Jonnu Smith's numbers have never really been great under Arthur Smith, and that's true. But in 2019, Arthur Smith's offense had A.J. Brown, Corey Davis, and then Adam Humphries actually had a bunch of targets that season. In 2020 in Tennessee, A.J. Brown, Corey Davis, Adam Humphries, and believe it or not, but Anthony Ferkser had a bunch of targets that year, if you remember him. And then in the 1 year that they were together in Atlanta, Drake London was the guy. Kyle Pitts had a bunch of targets, and actually Bijan Robinson had 86 targets that year. So tell me who's getting the targets in Pittsburgh beyond DK. And that's the only reason why I don't think Jonnu is completely devoid of value in Dynasty. Now, could it maybe be a 1 or 2 year thing? Yes. But I don't think he's completely devoid. Would I rather have Harold Fannin and Terrence? Of course I would. But of course I would. But I'm just saying that I don't think it's a complete death blow in an offense that really does not have a lot of pass catchers who you can come out and say, that guy's going to get 8 to 10 targets every single week. It's only DK, and that's it.
Jonnu Smith is now on his 5th team since 2020, which tells me the
third
NFL,
with Arthur Smith.
I know. It tells me what the NFL thinks about him, and that just makes me a little bit nervous.
All right. But I'll push back on you a little bit. How many teams did Baker Mayfield play for?
Cleveland, Carolina, Rams, and Tampa. Yeah, it's different to me when it's a tight end who is going to be going into his age 30 season. Like it's just it's a little different for me.
We don't disagree on several things here. I just think that Jonnu is still going to bring a little bit of value this upcoming season because of what the Steelers roster is currently constructed as. And right now, when your number 2 wide receiver is Robert freaking Woods, I mean, that means that Jonnu, who has a relationship with Arthur Smith, and if Jonnu Smith goes out there and averages 9.5 fantasy points per game, that's probably like in the top 15, Marcus, because the position is garbage for the most part.
All right, let's talk about the player that stands to gain the most value in Miami with Jonnu Smith now off the roster. We'll get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Do you ever wish that managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're trying to grow your savings or you're planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, all of your investments, and your spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building your wealth. My family has used Monarch Money for 7 or 8 months now, but I lost track. But it's absolutely fantastic. We were wasting so much money on trivial things, coffee runs, food delivery, takeout, whatever. But now we are saving more. We're actually building some wealth. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That is monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We are breaking down all the ramifications from the Jonnu Smith trade on Monday to the Steelers. Let's shift our attention to Miami, who now has a massive hole at tight end. But which player in this Miami offense do you think gains the most value now that Jonnu is gone?
To me, it's Jaylen Waddle. But I would say this. I mentioned Kyle Pitts. Could he potentially be a trade target of the Miami Dolphins? Michael Mayer is wasting away in Sin City. Could he be a trade target of the Miami Dolphins? Because right now their tight ends are who? Farrell Brown and like Julian Hill. I mean, like these guys are not.
I just say a couple of my guys for the Raiders, covering them for a long time, doesn't sound like they want to give away Michael Mayer. If the Raiders get like a massive offer, then maybe, but they're not going to trade him for like a day 3 pick or anything.
I'm just thinking pie in the sky in Dynasty. I mean, I would love to see that happen. But you mentioned, I mean, Jonnu Smith leaves by 111 targets. It's still crazy to me because Mike McDaniel never used a tight end in his offense. And then last year, Jonnu Smith, that's not going to really, amount to anything. And he was a tight end 4, 111 targets, 88 catches, 884 yards, 8 touchdowns. That's bananas. Waddle suffered last year. So did Tyreek Hill. We'll talk about him. Waddle went from 7.4 targets per game in 2023 to 5.5 per game last year. His points per game went from 14.2 to 10. And his points per game average has actually dropped in 3 straight years. That's another story. Yep. But now those 111 targets, Marcus, are going to get dispersed throughout the wide receivers because we don't have a tight end right now in Miami that's going to catch the ball at a high rate. And so Waddle's value across the board right now goes up because he's coming off a bad season, but we know how good he can be. And he has been for the majority of his career. So this is big for Jaylen Waddle. Once again, that all depends on Miami not going out and grabbing via trade a pass catching threat to the target share for Jaylen Waddle. But right now, still a young guy. This certainly helps his value across the board in fantasy.
Yeah, I've got no doubt that Jaylen Waddle is going to have a bigger year. And first of all, I think he's incredibly undervalued in Dynasty, even before the Jonnu Smith trade. Wide receiver 27, only 26 years old. I look at someone like Zay Flowers, who's wide receiver 24, who's never really had a monster season, or Chris Olave, who's 25, wide receiver 25 as well. And he's got the concussion issues. I think Jaylen Waddle is in a really good spot, but that's actually not the person that I think is going to get the most value in Miami. I actually think it's Devon Achane, who's going to get more of those layup targets, because that's what Jonnu Smith got a lot last year. If you look at his ADOT, it was one of the worst of his career. It was a lot of these just short underneath targets as basically a safety option. I wouldn't be surprised if that's just Achane getting more and more of those receptions. He already had 78 catches last year. Why couldn't we see him get even more work in the passing game? Maybe a little bit less as a runner. Maybe he doesn't get to 203 carries. Maybe it's more like 175, but it's Achane that's taking over more of this Jonnu Smith role.
Is there a running back, though, that you would move Achane ahead of from an ADP perspective? I agree with you. I think we could see Achane get a few more of those dump off passes, and we know how explosive he can be. He gets the ball in his hands, 50% chance he's taking it to the house. But he's so highly ranked already because of the explosiveness, because of his versatility, because of his age. Do you think there's somebody that he might jump at the position?
There's only a couple guys, right? Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Ashton Genty are the clear top 3 running backs. And then it's Saquon Barkley at RB4. And then there's a big gap to Achane. I don't think he's jumping any running backs.
You don't think he jumps Saquon?
I don't know. I mean, I probably would take Achane over Saquon, but I'm also just not taking either of those guys at the back end of back end of round 1, which is where Barkley's going right now.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'm going with the youth, man. I got to be honest with you. I am down on Barkley in Dynasty. He's coming off the best season he's probably going to have for the remainder of his career. 29 years old next year. So I could see Achane over Barkley, and maybe Jonnu Smith not being a part of the offense anymore, pushes some people to move him ahead of Barkley.
So the other question I had for you, is there any chance that one of these other receivers in Miami ends up taking over this role? We know that under Mike McDaniel, this has been very much just the offense goes through Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. Could we see them use more 3 and 4 receiver sets to kind of mitigate the loss of Jonnu Smith, or is that just not really part of Mike McDaniel's DNA?
Well, I think they've got to, run more 11, because who's their tight end? Their tight end's not going to be a big part of the offense. And the tight end was never a big part of the offense before Jonnu, it was just bananas, because it went completely against every trend that Mike McDaniels had as an offensive head coach in Miami. Now, Nick Westbrook-Akina could see a little bit of a bump in value, but we're not getting excited about him in dynasty leagues. Is he worth a late flyer? Okay, sure. He's a guy who has had a penchant for getting into the end zone, and so maybe some of those touchdowns go in his direction. But I still think that Waddle and, to your point, Achane are going to benefit. And we're going to talk about Tyreek Hill too. I think he also will benefit from Jonnu Smith no longer being there.
It does feel like they're going to grab somebody at tight end. They're not going to go into the season with Julian Hill and all of these guys, whether it's a really unspectacular name. Like, I'm just going to throw out some names that could be traded, like a Luke Schoonmaker in Dallas, right? Who, is fighting to be the number 2 tight end, or
great
something.
2nd round pick by Jerry Jones, by the way.
Just always have to get a shot at Jerry Jones. You know what I mean? Like something like that. Maybe, maybe the Commanders want to move on from Zach Ertz to give Ben Sinnott more snaps. Maybe it's someone like Zach Ertz. Maybe they go out and get Chigakonkwo. I don't know. I'm just throwing out names. I can't believe this is going to be their tight end situation. What about someone like Tyler Higbee? The Rams drafted Terrence Ferguson in round 2 this year. I think Tyler Higbee could be available for a really cheap price.
I would be surprised if the Dolphins didn't bring someone else in. Free agency is probably not going to be that method, but the trade route could certainly be. And, some of those names make a lot of sense, but it would be very interesting if they brought in someone like a Kyle Pitts. And you've talked about how the Raiders folks that say they're not going to give Michael Mayer up for a ham sandwich, which is, fine. But if they brought in somebody like that, then, even Pitts, who's been the Pitts for the last 3 years, that was the worst dad joke in the history of dad jokes. he still would warrant and garner targets in this offense. It'll be interesting to see what the Dolphins do or don't do.
My general stance is I'm just not going to care too much about who the Miami tight end is, whether it's Schoonmaker, Michael Mayer, because I just don't think that has been a role that they've prioritized under Mike McDaniel. I think Jonnu was a special situation last year. It was a special season because of all the other things they had going on. So in general, I'm just staying away from this Miami tight end situation until something big changes.
Agreed.
All right, let's talk about the two veteran receivers, Tyreek Hill, DK Metcalf. How much value do they gain or lose from this trade? We'll tell you next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Show. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, host Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. All right, Fabs, let's talk about the other receivers here. Let's start with DK Metcalf, who is the clear-cut number one receiver in Pittsburgh right now. Does the Jonnu Smith trade help him? Does it hurt him? Or does it really not do anything?
I think the only way that it would hurt him is if Arthur Smith decided to run. What would 5 tight ends be on the field at the same time? Right?
Five personnel, 0-5.
Yeah, I mean, like, nothing's going to hurt DK in this offense. Like in terms of what they can do. If nothing else, Jonnu Smith is another weapon that opposing defenses kind of have to pay a little bit of attention to. So maybe it helps DK. It's not going to hurt his target share. It's not going to hurt his ascending fantasy value. And it's not going to hurt the opinion of Aaron Rodgers, who loves Metcalf and actually said on the Pat McAfee show that Metcalf was a big reason why he went to Pittsburgh.
Because Are you believing anything Aaron Rodgers says, though? Let me just start there.
In terms of the wide receivers, yes. Because wide receivers and Aaron Rodgers have made beautiful fantasy music together over the years. I mean, Mark, whether it's been Donald Driver, Greg Jennings, obviously Devontae Adams, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, like go down the list. Devontae and Garrett Wilson last year. Wherever Aaron Rodgers is, wide receivers, or at least one, typically have a very big season, and that's going to be DK Metcalf and all them muscles. How do you have that body and eat like candy all day long? I don't have any idea. I wish I had those genetics. But the bottom line here is that this is not going to hurt DK. It can do nothing but help him to draw defenses away a little bit, because Jonnu Smith, no matter what you think about him, is a talented guy who's very versatile. I think he's a wide receiver in a tight end's body, and you're going to have to at least pay attention to him on the defensive side of the football.
I think this is a major win for DK Metcalf for a couple of reasons. Number one, he just occupies a different part of the field than what he does, right? Jonnu Smith plays in the middle of the field. I know that Jonnu lined up a lot outside, but if you watch Miami's offense, it's a lot of this, him motioning out wide outside to create matchups for other guys inside. He didn't actually get a lot of targets when he was lined up outside. Jonnu Smith's game is inline, yards after catch, middle of the field, right? So that part of it works well with Metcalf. The other thing is, we knew that the Steelers were going to make a move to get another passing weapon, right? They had to. They, with all the guys they have on the roster right now, it just wasn't enough. And if Jonnu Smith is the only other move they make, that's great for DK Metcalf, because that just locks them in to this massive target share, because Roman Wilson has never caught a pass in the NFL. Calvin Austin is 5'8", maybe 165 pounds. He's not really proven at all. They've got a running back in Caleb Johnson who doesn't catch passes out of the backfield. Yes, they've got all these tight ends, but tight ends don't earn that big of a target share. And on top of that, I just think the Steelers are going to throw the ball more than they did the last couple of years, and you're looking at maybe 500 passing attempts. Why couldn't DK Metcalf get 170 of those targets?
You just have to keep in mind, and I agree with everything you said. I love DK Metcalf this season. I love it, love it, love it. But you have to keep in mind that this is like a 1 year kind of like, all right, we don't know what's going on in 2026. So in Dynasty, if you have DK Metcalf, you are loving life right now. And if you've got a championship caliber team, he's going to help you. He's going to help you get to that title. But long term, That's where the question marks come in with DK. Who's throwing him the football? Who's the offensive coordinator? Does it continue to be Arthur Smith? What direction do they go on the offensive side of the football? We always know what the Steelers, the Steelers are Steelers football, ground and pound, play good defense, that kind of thing. But for this upcoming season, DK Metcalf, I think Marcus has a shot to be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver.
100% agree. I still, you're right. Like, you're right about all of the concerns long-term. Who's the quarterback? Who's the offensive coordinator? Who are the other weapons? But he's wide receiver 26 in Dynasty right now. And I look at guys like DJ Moore, who's being drafted ahead of him. I
agree with you. I'm right on board with you.
What about Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 21? He's going to be 30 this year. Obviously, I like Washington's quarterback situation better.
Yes.
Even someone like T. Higgins is locked into being the number 2 receiver in Cincinnati. He's got great quarterback play, but he's always going to be a little bit limited. I just think DK at wide receiver 26 is a very, very good value for this year and long term, because Fabs, they also paid him a boatload of money. Yeah, yes. I don't see the Steelers in round 1 next year drafting a receiver, because they're going to be trying to get their quarterback, and they're not going to have the cap space to go out and pay a receiver if one was even available in free agency, because they don't become available. He's just locked into 150 targets every single year moving forward.
Yep. Great points. And the Steelers are a very proud franchise, and my guess is that they won't want to go into any season with the likes of a Mason Rudolph under center, which of course they were going in that direction this season before they made the move that Marcus and everyone else seemed to know that was going to happen, was that they brought in Rodgers.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about Tyreek Hill, wide receiver 33 on our latest batch of Dynasty League ADP, just behind our guy George Pickens. 31 years old. Have back-to-back 1,700-yard receiving seasons before 2024, dealt with a wrist injury. Now that Jonnu's gone, could we see Tyreek get even more work?
Yes, certainly. But I don't know how much this means in terms of Dynasty, because he is a 31-year-old wide receiver who's coming off a season where his yards per catch average dropped from 15.1 to 11.8. His receiving points added went from plus 81.3 down to plus 19.9. That's based on next gen stats, which is like this crazy rabbit hole that I fall down all the time. He was less effective after the catch, 306 yards after the catch last year. He was at 690 in 2023. The target share dropped. We know that because Jonnu Smith was such a big part of that offense, but I mean, that should bounce back up. That should certainly bounce back up. So that's a good thing. So in the short term, it's good for Tyreek Hill because you're going to get more opportunities. But some of the stats that I just rattled off to you are a little concerning, because he's getting to the point now where it's like, do the physical abilities, the skills, do they start to diminish a little bit? No matter who you are, it's going to happen. All right. No matter, unless you're Jerry Rice. And I guess it happened to him too, but it's going to happen. And you wonder if not producing as many yards after the catch, not producing as many receiving points added last season was a sign that maybe things are going to start to go downhill for Tyreek Hill. But I do think, and I think you'd agree, Marcus, that having Jonnu Smith and those 111 targets gone, he's going to absorb a bunch of those, and that's a good thing. And that's going to help at least his seasonal value in 2025.
Here's the number one reason why I'm kind of in on Tyreek Hill this year. Storm Duck, Artie Burns, Kendall Sheffield, BJ Adams, and Ryan Cooper. Do you know who those guys are? Those are the cornerbacks
yes,
on the roster for the Miami Dolphins.
But
the
most
Dolphins
people don't. Yes.
Yeah. Those corners are awful. I mean, they're by far the worst in the league. And listen, Miami knew that, and they still traded away Jalen Ramsey. I think that's how big of a pain in the butt Jalen Ramsey might have been for them. But I just think this Miami team, they're not going to stop anybody, and they're going to get into the shootouts. And I kind of think Mike McDaniel embraces that. Hey, let's go toe to toe. Let's see who can score 50 points. Again, I know from a dynasty perspective, yes, that's scary, but we're talking about wide receiver 31. So it's not like you're paying an elite price to go out and get Tyreek Hill.
Right.
But yeah, would it be shocking? To me, it wouldn't be shocking if he's 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns this year, and he's a top 5 or 6 fantasy receiver. And again, we can debate what it's going to look like in 2026 and beyond, but I mean, there's just very few receivers in the league that have the chance and the ability to be the overall wide receiver one. And I think Tyreek still has it.
You have a little bit more faith in him than I do. But I agree with what you're saying. I don't know that Tyreek Hill is going to ever be a top 5 fantasy wide receiver again, but can he be a low wide receiver one? Yes, absolutely. I think so. Is his ceiling a top 5 player? I don't know about that anymore. Again, I don't like what I saw in terms of.
It's only 1 year though. It was 1 year of down production, and again, they remember Tua missed a good chunk of the season with a concussion, and again, that's always a risk. That's always a risk.
But if you look at the stats, he was lousy with Tua too. He wasn't that good. Like without Tua, he was worse. Yes, there's no question about that. But even with Tua, his numbers were way down compared to the previous year. True. And so that's what just concerns me is a little bit is those, those metrics and the analytics that the nerds like, you and I will look at. And I put you in the nerd category. I'm sorry.
I embrace it.
But, yeah. but what I'm saying is that I don't like what I saw there. And hopefully we see that sort of rebound. And, Tyreek is also like, off the field. You never know what's going on with that dude. So that's why I still feel like where you're getting him right now in Dynasty is completely fine. He does come with a little bit of risk. And you also have the possibility that the ceiling is lower. And I would argue it probably is because he was an elite wide receiver for a long, long time. But you make a great point with Miami's defense. That's what you got to look for a lot of times from a fantasy standpoint, whatever kind of league you're in. If it's like the Lions last season, their defense just went to hell with injuries, but their offense was scoring a gazillion points to keep up with the opposition. That is fantasy gold, Jerry. It's fantasy gold.
Which is exactly what happened with the Bengals last year. They were able to support Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Mike Gesicki, and Chase Brown because their defense was so bad. Honestly, I think Miami's defense is going to be just as bad as Cincinnati and Atlanta and some of these other teams. So I'm fine paying sticker price on just about every player in Miami because of that offense and because of what they're going to have to do to try to win games. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, it's a Matt Williamson day. Make sure you guys tune in for that. We'll answer your Twitter questions. Follow Fabs on Twitter at Michael_Fabiano. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here on Wednesday.